Two guys are given a message, and there is a time element to that message. That's really, it's a really simple conceit. Yeah, two people have got to get to a place before a certain time, but no matter what, and things happen to them on the way, and that's it. And the film in itself, because of that, is a slice of time.
Fundamentally, it's a very simple story. Two men have about 8 hours to get from one part of the Western Front in 1917, in the middle of the First World War, to another.
So they've got to cross no man's land, cross into enemy territory on a race against time to deliver a message that will save 1,600 lives. One of their brothers is there as well. And that's the heart of it. The heart of the story is just a message needing to be delivered by this time, and if it's not, these people will die needlessly.
There's something about the momentum and the ticking clock and really experiencing it through the perspective of these two men's eyes as they experience it that really drives the narrative, and drives it in a way that makes us as the viewer completely invest in these two characters and what they need to do and get done.
I think for me, the most important theme was the idea of sacrifice, what you do for other people and what you owe other people. And very much involved in that was the concept of family and of home.
It's 2 hours out of life, and it's a life that you sort of see kind of not necessarily through Schofield's eyes, but you're attached to him within that 2 hours, and that's what I think is so beautiful about the script, and I hope comes across in the final piece.
We see them and experience them as they do. So there's something about the uniqueness of that experience of we get information as they get information, and I think that in turn makes us completely with them.
What's been amazing is watching this film come to fruition. It was an idea that Sam had brewing, but he has lots of ideas brewing which don't always come to fruition. But with this one, there was a personal connection.
My grandfather told me a story about carrying a message on the Western Front in 1917. He was a small man and he was very fast, and his job was often to carry messages from post to post. But that kernel of an idea sat with me, and I was always fascinated by the war, perhaps because my grandfather told me about it when I was very young, 9, 10, 11.
I'm a bit of a history nerd. He didn't know this when he called me up. I've always kind of been interested in the World Wars. I thought World War I was fascinating. I'd kind of read all about it. My gran and grandpa both loved war movies, so I grew up on them.
You know, one of the things we take for granted is we in the West, at least in England, are born in peacetime. Unless you're now in your mid-60s, 70s, you were not born during a war, and you have not known a war on this scale.
Me and George, we went out to France and Belgium, and there's so much on World War I out there. You know, as we looked at memorials, museums, some preserved trenches that we actually walked through, and I look back on that trip now, and it was really, I gained so much from that, and it definitely gave us all this sense, an idea of what it was all about to be.
I think he felt almost duty-bound to bring to life not specifically his grandfather's experiences, but the experiences of many people during that First World War. And the fact that now we're over 100 years later, to some extent people have forgotten about what happened in the First World War. And I think he wanted to bring that to life.
I also read a book called The Western Front Diaries, and it's just snippets of soldiers' diaries in this book.
I've always wanted to write a big war movie. I think sometimes youngish women aren't the obvious choice to write big war movies. And so to be given this chance and this opportunity, I just was like, seize it, both hands, dig in, hope for the best.
Actually, my great-granddad was, he had a diary entry in that book, and he talked a little bit about how he went into no man's land and he got shot through the hip and he was paralysed, and he laid out there for 4 days and survived. So I read that book pretty much every day before I walked onto set, just to sort of get me in the zone.
It was eye-opening. I couldn't believe that the man that I knew, this very loquacious, charming, theatrical, funny, chatty storyteller of a man, had this horrific experience as a young man.
This film is being shot, all one camera, and every scene is one long take. And as an actor, that is such a privilege and really an advantage, because it really allows you to just throw yourself into the scene. And there were so many scenes that I just completely got lost in. And when they'd call cut, I would completely forget who I was. And I was Blake, and there were scenes that sometimes were 6 minutes long, and doing that was a real honour. And I learnt so much about the character, about me, and a lot about filmmaking.
I don't want people thinking about the camera particularly. I want people only thinking about the emotional journey these men are taking. But it does have a compound effect, a gradual growing menace. Something is coming, something unstoppable. And combine the technique of the filmmaking with the fact that we're moving always forward, not always walking, sometimes running, sometimes in trucks, sometimes in the river, sometimes carried by forces greater than themselves. But it never goes back.
The one shot of the whole film is really immerses you into the film. You feel you're like on the journey with these two young men, and you feel everything that they're going through, and you never leave them
until you actually see it on a screen, and the shots are joined together as though it's one. You don't really realize how immersive it is, and how that technique kind of draws you into it, and how you're not really aware that it's one shot. And that was what was surprising to me, that I'm watching the film the other day. After a while, you're just not aware it's a single shot. You're just completely drawn in, and it's almost like it's a magnet or something. The fact it is one shot, because in a way, cuts are often disruptive, even though they're not meant to be. That you are aware of a cut, but here not. It's almost more claustrophobic in a way. You've got no way out. There's no sudden wide shot. You know what I mean? It's like, boom, you're drawn into it, and it's like grabbed you from the start. It's really interesting.
The uniqueness of the story was about this very emotional journey. And then my reaction to seeing that it was going to be one shot was, wow, that's a great idea. And how the heck are we going to do that? But also, I was extremely excited by it because I could absolutely see the logic for it. Also, the script was so well crafted that it was clearly written to set up that idea technically.
We knew it was going to be one shot. And some of the original challenges in the script were just wrapping your mind around that. When you go to a new scene, how do you get in and out of scenes in an interesting way that doesn't feel double beating? How do you make sure that you don't repeat action? How do you make sure that you tell a cohesive story in a very kind of real-time bubble? So they were all challenges, and they were all like cerebral challenges. You just had to think your way out of a lot of these problems.
The challenge of the technique of doing it in one shot is sometimes you felt you needed to see the environment, but most of the time it's a very personal story, and you wanted to be kind of intimate with the characters. So it was a balance finding that, and I think we found it very early on discussing discussing the look and doing sketches and having a storyboard artist do different versions and just gradually working out how far can we go in terms of how do we get to a wide shot? Is that too self-conscious? How do we move around to see the environment? How can we intensify the moment with a camera movement but not make it too ostentatious, if you like, you know? I think it was a balance because, you know, we didn't want to do anything where you're just behind the characters following them all the time, which, you know, scarily that's what maybe your first thought of the story is. Okay, I'm following these two guys and we're just following them behind or in front and that's it. They had to find ways of making it much more descriptive.
You never leave them for one moment. And I think if you told it in a conventional way in a normal film, I don't think you'd have felt the energy, and it's not just the excitement, but also the trepidation that they were going through. You know, when they go up and over into no man's land, they have no idea what they're going to come across. And just being able to follow them, I think it really brings you so much closer to everything that, you know, these soldiers went through when they were sent on these missions.
The beauty of the film is that you do forget it's one shot. And as you journey through the movie and you get swept up with Blake and Schofield, you aren't thinking about how the movie is being achieved. And I think that's its strength.
Blake is a Lance Corporal. He hasn't had much experience with war at all. He's only recently just been deployed there. And he has a friend, Schofield, and one day, the point where our story starts off is they get sent on a mission to deliver a message to stop an attack on the Germans. And it's not just a mission to Blake, it's more of a personal mission because his brother is a part of the attack and he doesn't want to lose his brother.
Dean feels younger. I think he is younger than George. Perhaps a different class, a little bit more street, a little less experienced, has been there for a shorter time, has not seen combat.
Blake, throughout the whole film, is constantly reminded about his family and his brother and missing home, and his desperation keeps him fighting on throughout the whole film. And they get into these terrible, scary situations in World War I that every 2 seconds they don't know what's around the corner.
There's a sweetness about him, a naivety. He's a naturally good-spirited joker, really, and someone who chats, a chatter, rather than someone who holds his cards close to his chest.
Schofield, like Blake, is a Lance Corporal, but unlike Blake, he's had way more experience in war. Schofield has a wound stripe on his arm, and which represents that he's already been to a battle and been injured and wounded, and then he came back after recovering. So he's already seen stuff and already knows what's over the other side of the trench. Unlike Blake, he doesn't have a clue.
There's a kind of quiet nobility to him, a sort of understated heroism, which I thought was beautifully embodied by George. You know, to a degree, he brings that with him for free. He has that about him as a person, and that's what one is looking for.
The cast that Sam and Nina have assembled for this is it's really amazing, and I think a credit to the script that Sam and Krysty have written, that they wanted to come and be a part of it. But it's been great to kind of watch people come in for a couple of days here and there, and watch them do their thing and how it differs, and how they slot into something, you know, the kind of vibe that we've got up and running, but then also how these kind of top professionals bring their skill set to it.
One of the things that was unusual about the film is that a lot of the smaller parts, the parts that frankly the bigger actors carried, so Benedict Cumberbatch or Andrew Scott or Mark Strong, they only had maybe a day on the film or sometimes 2 days, and they had to come into a scenario where everyone else has been working together for weeks, sometimes months, and they had to just hit their mark and capture that character in the time that was available. And all of them were absolutely pitch perfect. They were so well prepped, and they seamlessly were able to join the rest of the cast and to feel part of that cohesive whole.
Andrew had this kind of real liquid, sort of playful nature. And a real sadness as well, that not sort of the surface level of this guy is Leslie, who's seen too much and yada yada, and so he's just kind of like, he's a cynic. But there's a real, like, Andrew brought this real pathos to kind of the moment of saying goodbye to those guys, and he's sort of, again, it wasn't self-pitying, but it's someone who's laboured with, like, I've got to send 2 more guys, I know they're not going to make it.
George Mackay, who plays Schofield, he did 6 months of rehearsals with us, and seeing him transform over that time was incredible. He came in and he looked like a young kid, and by the time we finished the film, he was without question a man. His attention to detail and the work and the commitment that he put into the part was extraordinary.
I've loved working with George. Me and George, we've been through so much on this film together. The ups, the downs, the hard work, tears and everything you can imagine. And it really did feel like a teamwork, this film. I never once thought that I was on my own at all with any of it. And every scene I had with George, I've learnt so much from him as an actor and as a person, and just being able to watch him in the scene was honestly beautiful.
I've never really seen it in an actor before. He completely immersed himself in the part. He was doing training for physical training. He was going on boot camps, learning how to fire guns and rifles. And I've never seen anyone put that kind of commitment into a part.
George has honestly thrown himself, 100% into this role, into this film. And watching him go from the start, to the end of the film is just, I honestly have to take my hat off to him. And I do love him to pieces, and he's helped me for everything.
One of the wonderful things about Dean Charles Chapman's performance is that he has such a vulnerability as an actor. He really puts himself on the line in terms of his performance. And that's what makes the character so empathetic. You really care about Blake.
Roger Deakins, to be able to work with him and say that I've even just met the man is a big, big deal. Again, what he's done with this film is really beautiful. And, some of the camera work has just blew my mind. Things I didn't even realise were possible. And this, if you like filmmaking, if you're into seeing, films becoming what they are, this film is for that.
All the decisions came from the relationship between the camera and the actor. And that began with me and Roger sitting in a room going, how are we going to shoot this scene? Where is he going to be standing? Do you not want to have that line on camera? Because if you have a dialogue scene, to state the obvious, what I didn't want, and neither did Roger, and we don't do at any point in the movie, is hinge the camera back and forth between 2 people speaking dialogue. To me, that you might as well cut. That's not what I wanted. What I wanted was one ribbon, like a snake, moving forward, in which the information that you needed happened to fall in front of where the camera was pointing.
When we were moving from 360 or turning around one corner in a trench, perhaps we would have to build the set in a certain way so that the camera could manoeuvre into a new position. But at the same time, we were all absolutely committed to the idea that we would never want the camera to go to a place that didn't feel natural within the scene. So that was the difficult part to navigate, I think, between cinematography and production design. And the challenge was to find those places, to marry all of those things that feel natural and feel organic within the scene.
There's scenes like in No Man's Land, there's big cranes and there's wire going in the sky and the camera's attached to this wire, and then suddenly it goes low to the floor, following me and George in No Man's Land, and then 2 grips just easily take it off and walk with it, and then they hook it back on, And then Blake and Schofield climb down this crater in no man's land, and then it flies down, and it's just constantly smoothly flying. And then I remember getting to see the plate shot, so like all the actors are standing in the way and the camera just does its job. And it was beautiful. It really is amazing and clever, and Roger is the man.
It's been a real privilege working with Sam, and again, as you say, to work on something that's so personal to him. I think it's a real privilege in any sense when someone offers themselves up personally, you know, in a relationship, in a friendship, when someone opens themselves up. It's really, you know, it's a privilege.
With Sam, good enough isn't good enough. Sam expects absolute. He's a perfectionist. He's like any filmmaker. He will absolutely push the boundaries as far as he can to make something better, and he inspires people.
He said he's not written anything before, but there's obviously this story's kind of bubbled up in him, and it's something that he wanted to get out and to tell.
It was such a personal film to him, and his inspiration is what drove everybody just to really up their game to the best of their ability. The set design is very unique. You're always moving forward. You never go back. You never see the same location twice. You never see the same piece of set twice. Again, in conventional filmmaking, you'd kind of shoot around and you would probably build maybe, 200, 300 yards of trench. We built well over a mile of these trenches.
To take in this atrocious mess that is no man's land, and these angry sort of barbed wire spikes, all just this kind of mess of this really violent image when you sort of raise your head over. I remember being really struck by that and kind of getting a sense of what they would be feeling as well, of like we've got to go through that. And that's also having done all the research and everything, and you sort of understanding and then it wasn't until you physically saw it, there was this kind of hopeless realization of like they were sending men over through that.
The hilltop towns and the small towns and villages of northern France were all utterly razed to the ground during the Great War. And now when you go to visit the sites of those battles, you're very struck by how the villages and towns have all been built in the middle of the 20th century. Nothing, what I would call, period, remains. So what Dennis was doing in part was constructing a lost world, was constructing a world that had now been destroyed entirely.
I hope audience enjoy the film, obviously, and I hope it teaches people, just like it's taught me, about World War I. People that don't know a lot about World War I, hope it gives them a good insight. I hope it teaches them about the sort of generation they were, and just to keep their memory and to never forget these soldiers, because, they really did fight for us.
I hope they're thrilled by it. I hope they're moved. I hope it makes them think of the people that they love, and the sort of, I guess, the massiveness of what everyone can achieve.
What I wanted an audience to do was, through the micro of these two men's journeys in real time, just 2 hours of real time, observe to some degree the macro, which is the immensity of the destruction, the vastness of the land, the thousands and thousands, millions of men, the appalling conditions, the staggering amount of waste and destruction and lives lost. And yet always to stick within the footprint of this 2 hours of real time. And I felt like if you were to look, it's like looking through a tiny, tiny keyhole into an enormous panorama of horror.